Hey there, and welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving deep into how our minds work. Like when we make a decision, and it feels so right at the time, but then later we're like, what was I thinking?
It happens to all of us.
Right, like that time I don't know, bought that, what was it, that bread maker? I was so sure I'd use it every day, but it's still sitting in the box.
Sounds familiar. We're often swayed by these hidden biases and we don't even realize it.
Totally. So we're using Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow as our guide today. I'm so ready to get into this.
Me too. It's amazing how much our intuition or gut feelings can sometimes lead us astray.
For sure. Okay, so let's jump right in. Kahneman talks about these two systems of thinking, right?
Yeah, it's like our brains have two modes of operation. System one is like that quick thinking, always on autopilot.
Right, like when you swerve your car to avoid something in the road, you don't even have time to think about it.
Exactly. Pure instinct, driven by emotion and past experiences. Then there's system two,
Which is,
your more deliberate, analytical self. The one that solves complex equations or plans a vacation itinerary.
but also the one that's a bit slower, a bit lazier.
Exactly. System 2 prefers to step in only when absolutely necessary. It's the voice in your head saying, do you really need that third slice of cake? When System 1 is already reaching for the fork.
Oh, that's so true. But this lazy controller idea, how does that explain those times when we miss something obvious? Like that invisible gorilla experiment Kahneman describes.
Well, it's like this. Imagine you're so focused on counting those basketball passes that your System 1, zeroed in on the task, filters out anything it deems irrelevant.
Even a gorilla walking right through the middle of it.
Exactly. You're so focused on one thing, you miss something else that seems glaringly obvious in retrospect.
It's like our brains have blind spots we're not even aware of.
In a way, they do. But the good news is, by understanding these systems, we can start to recognize those blind spots and make more conscious choices.
That's pretty amazing. So we've got System 1, the impulsive one, and System 2, the thoughtful one. But even with all its speed, System 1 loves to jump to conclusions, right? Filling in the blanks with whatever information it has on hand.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting. System 1 is a bit like a master storyteller.
Okay, how so?
Well, it takes whatever information it has, even if it's just a few scattered details, and weaves a complete narrative.
So it's like those connect the dots puzzles. Our brains sometimes draw the lines, even if some dots are missing.
Exactly. It's all about creating a coherent story, even if it means filling in the gaps with assumptions. Kahneman calls this WYSIAD, what you see is all there is.
WYSIAD catchy. Can you give me an example?
Sure, think about how you perceive success. You see someone who's achieved something impressive, maybe they landed a dream job or started a successful business. You're seeing the highlight reel, but you're missing the years of hard work, the setbacks, the doubts. But our System 1 often overlooks those missing pieces and jumps to conclusions.
So we're comparing our behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. No wonder we feel inadequate sometimes.
Exactly. And social media just amplifies this effect. We're constantly bombarded with these curated versions of reality, which can really skew our perceptions.
It's like everyone else is winning, except for us.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting point. This idea of jumping to conclusions is also linked to what Kahneman calls the hot hand fallacy.
Oh, right. Like when you're playing basketball, you hit a few shots in a row, you feel like you can't miss.
Exactly. We tend to see streaks of success as evidence of skill, when in reality, a lot of it often comes down to chance.
You mean it's not all about my amazing free throw technique?
Well, maybe a little bit, but think about it like flipping a coin. Just because you get a few heads in a row doesn't mean you're suddenly a coin clipping expert or that the odds have changed.
So that hot streak could just be pure luck. That's kind of a bummer.
It can be, but it's also a good reminder not to get too carried away by short-term success or to read too much into patterns that might just be random.
So our brains are always looking for patterns, even when they're not really there.
Exactly. It's how we make sense of the world, but it can also lead us astray. Which brings us to another important concept: heuristics.
Heuristics.
Mental shortcuts, rules of thumb that help us simplify complex decisions. They're generally helpful, but they can also lead to predictable errors, which Kahneman calls biases.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these biases.
Well, one of the most common ones is the availability heuristic. Basically, it means we judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily examples come to mind.
So if you just watched a scary movie about sharks, you might be more afraid of swimming in the ocean, even though shark attacks are statistically rare.
Exactly. Or if a friend just told you about a bad experience they had with a certain airline, you might be less likely to fly with that airline, even if their safety record is excellent.
It's like our brains don't quite understand the difference between what's memorable and what's actually more likely to happen.
It's about how readily available that information is in our minds. And the more vivid or emotionally charged the information is, the more it tends to stick with us.
So how can we combat this availability bias?
Awareness is key. The next time you're making a decision based on something that just popped into your head, stop and ask yourself, am I being influenced by a recent experience or a vivid story, or am I looking at the bigger picture?
It's like hitting the pause button on our intuition and letting System 2 do a little fact-checking.
Exactly. Look for data, statistics, or alternative perspectives to balance out that initial gut feeling.
So it's about finding that balance between our intuition and our more analytical minds.
Precisely. Now, another bias that's really fascinating is anchoring. Have you ever noticed how the first piece of information you get about something can really stick with you?
Oh, totally. Like when you see a price tag on something for the first time, it kind of sets the bar for what you're willing to pay, even if it's totally arbitrary.
That's anchoring in action. Our judgments get tethered to that initial piece of information, that anchor, even if it has no logical
It's
relevance.
like our brains are hardwired to latch onto something, anything, to help make sense of things.
Exactly. It's a way of simplifying decisions, but it can also lead us astray.
Can you give me an example of how anchoring works in real life?
Sure, think about negotiating a salary for a new job. That initial offer, even if it's lower than what you're worth, can act as a powerful anchor, influencing the entire negotiation.
So even if I know I deserve more, I might still be influenced by that initial number.
Exactly. It's like that first number creates a frame of reference, and it can be tough to break free from it.
So what can we do about it? How do we avoid being anchored to something that's not in our best interest?
Well, one strategy is to be aware of the anchoring effect and to try to set your own anchor. Before you go into a negotiation, for example, do your research and determine what you believe is a fair and reasonable salary range.
So be prepared, know your worth, and don't be afraid to counteroffer.
Exactly. Don't let that initial anchor dictate the terms of the negotiation.
This is making me realize how much our brains rely on these shortcuts, these heuristics, even if they're not always in our best interest.
That's right. But the good news is that by understanding how they work, we can start to recognize them and make more conscious choices.
So it's about being more aware of the machinery of our own minds.
Exactly. Now, speaking of how our brains process information, another important concept Kahneman explores is framing. Have you ever noticed how the way something is presented can drastically influence your perception of it? Absolutely. Like, imagine you're at the store trying to choose a yogurt. One says 10% fat and the other says 90% fat-free.
Okay, yeah.
They're essentially the same thing, but which one sounds more appealing?
The 90% fat-free, for sure. Even though, like you said, they're practically identical.
Exactly. That's framing. It's about how the way information is presented, the way it's worded or structured can influence our choices, even if the underlying options are the same.
Wow, that is powerful. We can be so easily swayed by something as simple as wording.
Absolutely. And it's not always a bad thing. Framing can be used for good, too, like encouraging people to make healthier choices or save for retirement.
Like a mental nudge. Okay, so we've covered availability bias, anchoring, framing.
Hmm.
It's like our brains are wired to take shortcuts wherever possible. But those shortcuts sometimes lead to, well, let's call them miscalculations.
Right. And one of the biggest miscalculations Kahneman talks about is this idea of the illusion of skill. Have you ever felt like you were really good at something, like you had a knack for predicting certain outcomes?
Oh, totally. Like, maybe I'm not a financial expert, but I feel like I have a pretty good sense of the stock market.
A lot of people feel that way, but Kahneman's research suggests that we often overestimate our abilities, especially in fields with a lot of uncertainty, like finance.
You mean my stock market instincts might be totally off?
It's possible. Kahneman actually studied the performance records of financial advisors, these so-called experts in investing, over time.
And what did he find?
Their performance was practically random. No consistent evidence of actual skill over the long haul. One year, an advisor might beat the market. The next year, they might lag behind. It's like they were flipping a coin to make their recommendations.
Wow, so much for expert advice.
Well, it doesn't mean that all expertise is useless, but it does highlight how much we tend to overestimate the role of skill and underestimate the role of luck or randomness.
So in some areas, even the experts might not have all the answers. It's a humbling thought.
It is, but it's also freeing in a way. It
Yeah,
reminds us that it's okay to admit when we don't know something and to be open to different perspectives.
that's a great point. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from those two systems of thinking to heuristics, biases, framing, even the illusion of skill. It's like Kahneman has given us this amazing toolkit for understanding how our minds work. What's the best way for our listeners to start applying these insights to their own lives?
Well, the first step is awareness, right? Just knowing that these biases exist, that our brains are wired to take these shortcuts, is a huge step in the right direction.
So a little self-awareness goes a long way.
Exactly. And then next time you're faced with a decision, especially a big one, take a moment to pause and reflect. Ask yourself which system is driving this choice. Is it your gut feeling, your intuition, or are you engaging that more deliberate analytical part of your brain?
Right. And maybe do a little fact-checking while we're at it, just to make sure we're not being swayed by those unconscious biases.
Precisely. Challenge your assumptions, look for alternative perspectives, and don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure. It's so important to keep these conversations going.
And for our listeners, if you want to delve even deeper into the fascinating world of decision-making and cognitive biases, I highly recommend checking out Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a game changer.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious.